Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Thanks for demonstrating your knowledge of flaky California anarchist culture. Very impressive. I did have my infamous cliched formal introduction of "it's so good to see you all again, blah blah blah," not that it's not, but I was somewhat disarranged in that beginning because luckily your lovely company and interesting discussion about should you wear leather belts has cheered me up considerably, but I was really angry and upset because I went to the internet cafe near my flat to get copies of the handout because we're going to have so many people tonight, or were, wherever they are. And anyway, while I was there, if you can imagine this, there were three guys in the internet cafe watching porn, and the proprietor can see this, of course, and everything. And obviously I was really angry and really upset, and so I made a fuss about that in that situation and got laughed at basically by the men, and I was just so angry because I thought, I just think it's such an expression of the worst kind of unthinking privilege. It's just like, do they think how vulnerable and violated and objectified a woman seeing that is going to feel? Never mind the fact that it is direct evidence of exploitation. Do they think about the possible things that any woman walking into that place, how it will make her feel, you know? It's just such disgusting evidence of privilege, and I think there's far too many people, far too many men who don't think about that, just as we all don't think about the forms of privilege we enjoy. And I was so upset about that, and I was talking about it to Roger before the event, and he suggested that I should explain to people why I was upset and what that situation was, because I think it's important for us all to think about. I think it's important that men in the movement think about it, especially those who are resistant to, for example, an intersectional approach to veganism, and that they realise that a lot of the actions we take unthinkingly are so damaging and so violating to others on so many different levels. And so I just thought that I would explain that. Thank you, Roger, for the idea, because it just made me really angry and sad, and I expect it has the same effect on all of you. So that's kind of what my talk is about anyway. Rights, how rights are integral to a feminist position. So on that angering and disillusioning note, let's get back to my script. Yeah, I've tried hard to keep within time limits today, but we'll have to see how that works out, because some of it is unscripted and shit. So basically I'm going to talk about the theory and language of rights, critiques of rights-based thinking from the anarchist and feminist viewpoints, and the challenge which a real understanding of and commitment to this concept would pose to our currently divided and confused movement. So obviously that's a lot of issues to be dealing with in a short space of time, so I'll settle for outlining and explaining my own views as consistently as I can. So I want us to think, first of all, about our own movement, as we characterise it right now, the animal rights movement. A movement named for a concept which, apart from the meaningless remnants of rights language which are occasionally in evidence, has largely disappeared from it. Pointing this out is not popular, yet I believe wholeheartedly that the future of our movement depends on our recognition that something is fundamentally wrong with a movement claiming to be based on right, in which rights-based thinking and claims-making has become so problematic and controversial. Part of the reason for this, I believe, is that what we do in the name of animal rights has slipped so far away from the meaning of rights that to admit to this truth and strive to rectify it would require fundamental change in our strategy and claims-making. Far too often in our movement now, rights means a wish rather than action, and even more often and even more disappointingly, a slogan rather than a deeply held conviction. We want to consider ourselves as animal rights activists by default, I think. Like, it should be obvious because that's the name of our movement. I think what's really important for us to recognise is that it's not obvious, it's not universal, it has become a real deep understanding of rights theory has become a minority view, and I think that's really dangerous for the movement. That is my personal view, but yeah, I'm going to explain it here. As one example, again, a desperately unpopular example, as everyone in the Irish movement is well aware, is, for example, like we clamour for legislation to protect our fellow animals on so many levels. We celebrate legislation as a victory, and yet we call that animal rights. And what's problematic there is that there is no recognition of, yes, we're campaigning for this, and yes, we realise that it's not consistent with rights-based claims making. There's not even that amount of honesty about it. It's like, Roger doesn't want to publish this, or is he just checking that it works?
Yes.
He's contemplating how to not be associated with this statement, but
just checking it was working.
yes, but
you get into trouble so easily around here.
Yeah, but that point about our desperate eagerness for legislation, or our concentration on legislation in this movement, leads me to make one point which will surprisingly not appear very much in this talk, even though it is one of what I regard as the most important things for us to think about. The reason I'm not going to spend much time talking about it is because we're all going to talk about it, if we're happy with that. It's one of the major things, one of the major discussion topics, and that is the distinction between moral rights and legal rights. We confuse them all the time. We, as animal rights advocates, confuse them all the time. Equally, when rights-based claims making and theory is attacked from the anarchist and feminist point of view, legal rights are systematically substituted for moral rights, and rights theory is attacked on that basis. So when they're talking about rights, they mean legal rights. So what are legal rights? To me, they mean two things, basically. They mean either this, when we campaign for legal rights, we have this misguided desperation to share the top of the ladder, which is kind of how I characterise liberal feminism, for example. It's like, if we can share their privileges, if we can kind of break into the halls of power and get to share everything out, then things will be better, something will have changed. But that's not revolutionary. What it is, essentially, is counter-revolutionary because it's supporting, it's believing in, it's investing in that system, which rests on the fact there's got to be someone at the bottom of the ladder. Legal rights will never change anything because what they do is shore up that system of power. That's what they're designed to do. Nothing really threatening will ever enter legislation, because that's not what legislation is there for. And the second thing I think legislation is my horrible habit of quoting myself. That's only because I tend to agree with myself. It was in a leaflet that we were trying to make zine style the other day, so you guys will know this. But it's a way to disarm demands for revolutionary change. So it's like when people demand things change, oh yes, we've ticked that box, there's a law about that, so that's being cared for. And that disarms us. Oh, there's nothing we can say. That's what we wanted. You've acknowledged our existence because you've made some random assurance that if our rights are violated in any way, the cops are going to make some half-assed attempt to rectify the matter if they can be bothered. And that is legal rights. And it has nothing to do with what I speak about when I say that I am a rights-based justice advocate. I mean, I could spend the rest of this talk, I could spend the rest of this 2 hours, probably the next 3 or 4 of our meetings, talking about how much I hate legal rights and how much I hate the legal system and the cops and the so-called justice system and everything all that shit stands for. So I'm not against that. It's as an anarchist and as a radical feminist and as an animal rights advocate that I am demanding respect for rights. And I'm going to explain how, in my view, that is all consistent. So basically, can we all bear that distinction in mind? I'm not going to say anything else about it, oddly enough, because there's a lot I could say, but it will figure prominently in the discussion, so I thought I'd just move on. So I think it's the focus on legislation, which in my view is just destined to failure, complete dead end. I think that's defeating our movement, and I personally am hesitant to even use the term animal rights about our movement anymore. I often talk about the animal rights movement and then think, who am I talking about exactly? And again, this sounds like this incredibly smug elitist claim, like sort of, oh, obviously I'm exempting myself from that. I'm not. My claims making is problematic. Everyone, the language we use, the things we take part in and the things we support, how consistent we are with our claims making, is always problematic. So I'm not making this claim that, oh, I know the meaning of animal rights and I embody the ideals of the movement and everyone else needs to kind of match my standards. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that this is my personal conviction that animal rights means something more than what animal rights has come to mean to us. And I just think that's why I don't really use that term about the movement anymore, because I don't know what movement I'm in. You know, because I often look at a lot of campaigns and I think, am I in that movement? No. I'm really not. I don't want to be. I'm not questioning the motives, the sincerity, the urgency of what's being done, but I question its logic and its soundness and its basis in rights theory, and that's how it's problematic to me. So do we have an animal rights movement? I don't know. But anyway, a contradiction that a lot of people who knows anything about anarchist and feminist theory will be aware of here is that I'm a rights-based advocate, and that's a really unpopular minority view in both those movements. So I'm going to explain how, in my view, these things not only can but have to coalesce. I'm aware that I'm running way over time here. So first to the feminist critique of the concept of rights, which is multifaceted and very popular in the feminist movement. And yes, I will argue, based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what this concept means. And before I go any further, I'm a bit worried that there's a lot of kind of academic-y, jargon-type stuff in here. So, I'm not being horribly superior. Like, a short while ago, I didn't know a lot of these words, I'm just discovering them, and when I discover stuff I start to think in terms of that stuff, so I'm not deliberately being obnoxious, just inadvertently. Which unfortunately is a common occurrence. The feminist opposition to rights theory is summed up for me in the words of Catherine MacKinnon, if that's how you pronounce it, I don't know, but anyway, it's MacKinnon, who says, abstract rights authorise the male experience of the world. So let's think about that. I take issue with it on 3 counts. So if you're not all groaning inwardly, I'll elaborate. Firstly, it's a troublingly essentialist statement to talk about the male experience of the world at all. Yes, women, as we've been socially constructed as passive victims, either hidden from the world completely or dressed up and put on display, have unique experiences of oppression stemming from gendered power relations. And it would be revolutionary for us to create safe spaces to share these and to create community for rebelling against them. I am not denying that there are unique aspects in this world as it is now of the female reality. I don't deny that this reality contrasts starkly with the male experience of patriarchal society. What I object to is the assertion that this contrast is natural and inevitable, that male and female brains are hardwired to work in completely opposite ways, males in terms of rules and abstractions, females in terms of reality and caring. So where was I? Yes, male and female thinking. So as a radical feminist, I view many manifestations of gender difference as socially constructed and a form of oppression. And it's upon this conception of naturally contrasting male and female thinking styles that I feel the false opposition between the ethic of care and rights theory is based. So, that's my problem with the last 5 words of that statement, which, to refresh our memories, is abstract rights authorise the male experience of the world. So secondly, because I have 3 objections to this, if we remember, are rights abstract? I don't think so. With reference to my own life, I don't feel this is true. My right to my bodily integrity and my right to defend my bodily integrity against any kind of violation are not abstract to me. They are intensely practical, personal to me and to my life, and empowering. They inform the way I inhabit and know my body as a woman. They provide me with a new way of understanding and resisting patriarchal invasion. Crucially, they make me feel less invaded. They tell me that I deserve to be safe and valued, that I deserve love, respect and dignity, and that there are ways I can demand and create these things, even in an oppressive and oppressed world. So the language of rights appeals to me in a way that the language of care in isolation does not. It appeals to me as a radical feminist who feels that women have tolerated enough, and it appeals to me as a woman who is tired of bracing herself to confront a patriarchal world every time she opens her front door. To me, the statement I have needs is an appeal, while the statement I have rights is a demand. We have put off making that demand in a united, uncompromising and fearless way for far too long. So finally, my 3rd complaint is that I would wholeheartedly agree with MacKinnon's statement that rights authorise male experience at the expense of the female if one significant modification were made. Rights as they have been misused in the defence of patriarchal society. Basically what I mean by this is that men are tolerated when they claim respect for rights they don't have, let alone need, while women are ignored when they claim respect for rights which they have always had and desperately need. It is not rights that are the problem here, but the way the concept has been used, and I feel we should not imperil the future of our revolution by discarding it because it has been used like this. By this logic, the fact that it has been part of the history of patriarchy, by that logic, there is surely nothing left for us, because everything has. You know, it's just, it has nothing inherently to do with the concept that it is being misused like this. So I feel that by proposing the ethos of care as separate from and a challenge to rights theory, the feminist movement mistakenly equates the very existence of rights with the existence of gender hierarchy, and holds the concept itself as being responsible for its misuse. And I really struggled with this analogy, which is not a good one at all, and I don't claim it is, but I was just trying to think of it in material terms. And what I came up with is that's like holding the materials from which, for example, cages and chains have been made throughout history as being somehow responsible for the existence of slavery, when these materials might just as easily have fashioned weapons to arm history's revolutionaries in their fight for freedom. I would go further than that, though. One aspect I'm not happy with about that is that I consider rights not to be some neutral thing that can be used for either side. I consider rights to be inherently revolutionary and to have their meaning to have been stolen and corrupted. So that's not quite right, but anyway, to think about. And ruthlessly criticise in the Q&A. So our demands for rights are not part of the harmful language of the order that gives power to our oppressors. They are defiance of that order and of the whole logic of domination. Our reclaiming of them as the moral baseline of our movement is defiance of the way in which the concept has been appropriated and corrupted in order to be used against us in the oppressor's interests. So I'm aware this talk has turned into a feminist rant here, and we're in danger of going over time, so I'll at least attempt to confine myself to two more observations. The first being what I touched on earlier, the artificial opposition which has been constructed between needs and rights. So we kind of think by now, due to the history of the feminist movements in particular, as if we have to argue in terms either of needs or of rights. And that doesn't work because you cannot understand them in any terms, let alone campaigning terms, as being isolated from one another. It doesn't work. It's, as I say, artificial, I feel. Note feel rather than think. So needs, it is commonly argued within the feminist movement, are part of a complex reality in which there are not always any clear-cut right answers to be found, and where a rigid programme of moral rules cannot fit without harm. Yet I reject this assessment because I personally believe there have always been, and always will be, actions that are absolutely right and absolutely wrong. Obviously, it's particularly interesting that I say that as an anarchist, but more on that later, and don't worry, not much more. Rights arise from needs, basically. They are based on our understanding of all sentient beings as having intrinsic moral value. We are born with needs, therefore we are born with rights. And that's what I understand as being central to rights-based claims making, the intrinsic moral worth of individuals. And it's because I view that as being central to that concept that I view rights-based claims making in theory as having inestimable practical value to individuals. Basically, a deficiency of needs, in my view, is that they can be reduced to a statement of biological fact, whereas rights carry that statement to its moral and logical conclusion. An example of this, on the feminist theme, is the fact that I need to eat. I need nourishment for vitality and creativity and the care of others and recovery and strength. I have this need, and it follows from that I have the right not to be bombarded by advertisements telling me I must starve myself or be ugly, undesirable and rejected. Asserting this right shakes the foundations of patriarchal society, based on exploitation of unresisting women, a revolutionary army disarmed by starvation. That obviously is one example among many, but anyway, that's one. Interestingly, there is an example in a book called The Ethics of Care, Personal, Political and Global by Virginia Held. When this war between rights and care is unmasked as being essentially a war of semantics rather than opposing theoretical concepts. And I originally understood this to be, I hope this is the right expression, a slip of the tongue, meaning a mistake. Yeah. So, Virginia Held says, the care that is valued by the ethics of care can, and to be justifiable must, include caring for distant others in an interdependent world, and caring that the rights of all are respected and their needs met. So, as you can imagine, I was jumping up and down with excitement when I came across that one. And a guy called Jeffrey Spring, in an essay critiquing this book, called for the reclaiming of rights as moral practice embodying the values of care and justice. So that is a huge threat to the concept of these as antithetical claims. And it illustrates my own claim that to set them against each other is needless and harmful. Incidentally, Jeffrey Spring also calls rights pre-political moral claims, instead of assuming they're the apparatus of oppressive institutions. Pre-political, I think that's pretty crucial, actually, and really interesting. So another challenge, again, the last point I'll briefly go into before briefly again critiquing the anarchist critique of rights and then finishing up, is also the feminist accusation that they are individualistic and isolating, which just reminded me with Virginia Held's concept of the interdependent world, which tends to be a central part of the ethic of care. So are they an inherently negative program which forbids interference? Not in my view, because we have the right to real community and we have the right to meaningful connections with one another. To me, rights without community is meaningless. It doesn't make sense. It's like the age-old question, do you have rights in a vacuum, you know? Rights are about interactions and connections and communication with one another. They inspire caring and they demand caring and respect and responsibility. Again, to quote myself, I'm trying to avoid doing this, but it seems to keep happening to me, the fact that we have moral rights and the fact that we recognise the moral rights of others gives us moral responsibilities. Rights, the other side of rights is responsibilities, and our obligations, our moral obligations, are part of rights theory. So accusing it of being this negative, cold concept of abandoning each other and creating these walls around each other, the characterisation of rights theory as primarily defensive is, I think, something that's been forced on us by a violent world constructed from rights violations. We only have that concept of rights because of how we understand the world around us. So, to move on briefly, what do anarchists think about rights? I found Kropotkin in Anarchist Morality particularly interesting on this point, though I am aware that we have a Russian native speaker who will probably put me to shame with a better understanding of what he said than I have, but I'm just terrified that he wasn't talking about rights at all and you're now about to reveal this to me, just in case. Yes, what do anarchists think about rights? Again, I have one quote that exemplifies the common critique for me, and it's from Bob Torres, and we were recently talking about it. And it is, rights are granted by states. The particular context that he was referring to there was that he'd used the concept of rights in the subtitle of his book, and he was explaining why that was an unusual thing for an anarchist to do, since he called himself a social anarchist. And he said, you know, why do I do that? Since rights are granted by states. I think that exemplifies the common critique and what I have an issue with. Rights are not granted by states. You don't get some capitalist bigwig going around when people are just born saying, okay, we'll give you rights so we can systematically violate them for the rest of your life. It doesn't happen like that. What happens, yes, is that, as we discussed at the beginning of the talk, certain minimal amounts of legal recognition are given to certain needs in a way that has been constructed so it won't threaten the system, that's legal rights, which I hesitate to call rights. It has nothing to do with my concept of rights. So basically, I'm not going to dignify that critique of rights as moral rights with a response, because it has nothing to do with rights as I understand it. Though unfortunately there is an anarchist critique of moral rights understood as moral rights. And I have something to say about it here. Yes, I said some strands of anarchist thought have traditionally seen any attempt to claim a universal standard of morality or objective truth as in themselves oppressive. And I've yet to meet someone who can defend this disturbing assertion coherently. I've had loads of conversations myself with fellow anarchists that were extremely unproductive and basically degenerated into because I say so, and a lot of accusations that I was the thought police, you know. And what happens there is that nobody really believes it. Because I was talking to one guy who says no, he doesn't use the word morality, and he doesn't use right and wrong because these are tyrannical concepts that are forced on us from above, and he sees them as attacks on his autonomy. And he has his own universe, thank you very much, in which right and wrong do not figure. So how dare I claim to have this godlike knowledge of right and wrong? In the context we tended to have that conversation was inevitably what's commonly known as veganism, what is actually 100% plant-based diet. And I was saying, how is it anarchist to consume animal products, for example? And they would say, they wouldn't even defend it logically, they would just say, how is it anarchist for you to challenge me on a moral basis? And basically I would just say, does this look like anarchy from the point of view of the person you are victimising? And they didn't have a response to that either, so it most commonly, as I say, degenerated into because I say so. And a common thing, really, I just found here is it's really demoralising, because who would defend their freedom to oppress others, which is essentially what they're doing without claiming as much that that's what they're doing. And it never holds up when it gets onto things which are more socially accepted as wrong. For example, I made the dreaded analogy between dairy farming and rape, and of course, everyone blows up when I say that, and like, oh, so you're accusing me of abusing women. And I was like, wait, you have no morality. So I found something that's wrong, that's absolutely inflexibly wrong in this independent, morality-free world that you've created. And they don't have an answer to that. They just say, well, of course that's wrong. So basically, again, I don't dignify that with a response, because I've yet to find anyone who can defend it. Basically, to sum up, when anarchists talk about rights, they talk about them being granted by the state and ultimately being constructed in defence of the state. That is absolutely true. If we're talking legal rights, it's absolutely true. However, as I've explained, rather incoherently, but because I'm so indignant about it, the challenge to any moral code as being oppressive is, in my view, laughable and ridiculous and incapable of being consistent. So, I mean, to sum up on that as well, the anarchist vision is of institutions, kind of state institutions, institutions of coercion and control, being replaced by networks of voluntary and non-hierarchical associations which are mutually beneficial. And rights theory is entirely consistent with that vision. I would go further and suggest that it's an essential part of that vision. So it's as an anarchist that I demand respect for my rights, and it is as an anarchist that I strive to respect the rights of others in everything that I do. And to come back to Kropotkin and anarchist morality, there was some fascinating stuff. For example, his defence of what dear old Herbert Marcuse would call defensive violence, as being the right of people living under violently repressive regimes to respond in kind. Basically, he's talking about the moral right of self-defense as one example. And he also poses the question, speaking about the right to property ownership and how legal rights are repressive. He says, what right have you to dispossess the exploiter? In other words, by fighting for your own freedom, you are a possession. So you are violating their socially constructed right. I think that's important because the right to property ownership, I as an anarchist believe, is socially constructed, whereas the rights to life, liberty and dignity are not. And those are revolutionary. The legal right to property ownership is counter-revolutionary, it's oppressive. So basically what this position amounts to when we examine it is one huge misunderstanding. Anarchists rightly distrust the justice system and legal rights framework, seeing in those coercive institutions no potential for revolutionary change. And I completely agree with that. And it is because of that, rather than in spite of that, that I am a rights-based advocate. So to conclude with one of my favourite anarchist sayings, that total freedom comes with total responsibility. With that in mind, rights are everyone's responsibility, and in the best tradition of anarchist practice and theory, they are both destructive and creative. Once respected, they would destroy the old order and create a new one. This is how and why we need rights theory. We need a moral conception and practice of rights as a transformative revolutionary force. So, to sum up, the final question, and essential question for me, is this. In the world for which rights-based advocates fight, a world based on respect, justice, freedom, and yes, caring, would there be room for battery cages, for rape and domestic violence and human trafficking, for concentration camps where our fellow animals die in their millions, for vivisection labs, for capitalism? No, there would not. These things would vanish in that world. And that's all I need to know to understand that rights are revolution. Thank you.